The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to this webinar on efficient cooling considerations for Latin America. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to see, we have more people joining, so we'll start in a couple of minutes, so please hold tight. Thank you.
Hola. ¿No puedes hacer la prueba ya? ¿No? Sí debe de funcionar. Mira, bueno, probando. ¿Tienes micrófono?
Good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar on the IEA Special Report on Efficient Cooling Considerations for Latin America. The webinar is based on a publication produced by the IEA by the same name, which is available for free on our website in English. The webinar is organized by the International Energy Agency with kind support of the Mexican Secretary of Energy and Brazilian Energy Research Office, part of the Ministry of Mines and Energy. My name is Edith Bayer, and I'll be moderating the webinar. I'm joined by my colleagues Brian Dean and John Dulac, both lead authors on the cooling report, who will be carrying out the presentation. Here's the agenda for today. We'll have a short introduction to introduce you to the webinar platform, followed by welcome remarks from IEA, from Santiago Creueras, Director General of Energy Efficiency and Sustainability at CENER, and Thiago Barral, Director of Energy Economics and Environmental Studies at EPE. Brian and John will present on their special report, following a brief video that will set the stage. We very much want you to participate in the webinar and have reserved time at the end for questions and answers, and encourage you to post comments and questions in the comments box throughout the webinar. And please feel free to post those in English, Spanish, or Portuguese. And just a brief note on the attendee interface you should be seeing on your computer. There are two ways to connect to the audio of the webinar. One is through your computer's audio system. If you usually can hear music through your computer, you should be set to listen to the webinar in the same way. Alternatively, if you'd like to call in by phone, locate your audio pane and select Use Telephone. The telephone number and access code will then be displayed as you see on the slide. Please also note that we're recording the webinar and we'll make the link available for those who have missed it. And finally, following the webinar, you'll receive a short survey estimated to take 2 minutes. The survey will help us improve our webinars and be sure to focus on topics of interest to you in the future. So please look out for that following the webinar in your email. Now I'd like to invite our esteemed guests to make some introductory remarks. Santiago, we can start with you. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Edith, and welcome to the agency. Muchas gracias, muchas felicidades por tu nombramiento en la Agencia Internacional de Energía dentro del programa de eficiencia energética en economías emergentes y bueno, pues bienvenida al equipo de la agencia, de CENER y por supuesto también del Ministerio de Minas y Energía, quien se suma por primera vez a esta práctica de los webinars. Saludo, por supuesto, a mi colega de Brasil, Thiago Barral, que se suma a partir de hoy. Especialmente creemos que es una buena oportunidad para combinar fuerzas y tener mayor presencia de asistentes latinoamericanos en estos webinars. Esperamos que esto ayude a promover y a crear una comunidad de práctica en la región que respalde el desarrollo y, por supuesto, la implementación de políticas efectivas a largo plazo. Muy buenos días a todos. Por supuesto, saludo con afecto a Brian Dean y a John Dulac, funcionarios y amigos de la Agencia Internacional de Energía. Y bueno, pues por supuesto a Mel y a Brian y a todo el equipo que está conectado el día de hoy. En nombre de la Secretaría de Energía, me da mucho gusto que tengamos este webinar sobre el reporte especial de la Agencia Internacional de Energía sobre enfriamiento eficiente, algunas consideraciones para América Latina, y agradezco como siempre a la Agencia Internacional de Energía por todo el apoyo que nos han dado a lo largo de esta administración. Como ustedes saben, estos webinars los iniciamos aquí en México y han resultado ser un excelente instrumento para la capacitación y el desarrollo de habilidades en el sector energético, específicamente en el tema del consumo eficiente de la energía. Y bueno, pues esta práctica ya se volvió el día a día de la Agencia Internacional de Energía, lo cual nos da mucho gusto. Como ustedes saben, actualmente el uso de aires acondicionados y ventiladores eléctricos para enfriar espacios representa casi el 20% de la electricidad total utilizada en edificios de todo el mundo. A nivel global, en las últimas 4 décadas, la tecnología de los electrodomésticos, como los refrigeradores y los aires acondicionados, ha tenido un incremento significativo en su eficiencia energética. Estas mejoras han tenido como principal motor los estándares de rendimiento energético obligatorio. En México, estamos muy contentos y muy orgullosos de contar con normas o conocidos internacionalmente como estándares a la altura de las mejores economías del mundo, como lo son la norma ENER 11, 21, 23 y 26 para aires acondicionados de tipo central, tipo cuarto, tipo dividido y tipo inverter respectivamente. Y según la estrategia de transición para promover el uso de tecnologías y combustibles más limpios, los aires acondicionados junto con la iluminación representan 2 de los mayores potenciales de ahorro de energía en edificios comerciales. Y bueno, como muchos de ustedes saben, durante la Clean Energy Ministerial en Copenhague tuvimos la oportunidad de ser anfitriones como país de la iniciativa de enfriamiento de espacios de cooling ahí, y bueno, pues es algo que estamos promoviendo mucho como país. Pero bueno, antes de iniciar y de no quitar mucho tiempo a los panelistas que nos acompañan este día y al cumplimiento de la orden del día, quiero compartirles que a la fecha hemos realizado ya 20 webinars con un acumulado de alrededor de 3.540 asistentes, y si sumamos los más de 555 que se encuentran registrados el día de hoy pues estaremos en un número mucho mayor y esto nos da realmente muchísimo gusto. Además hoy, además de las personas de México, tenemos 62 personas conectadas de Brasil, 16 de Colombia, 12 de Argentina, 10 de Ecuador, 8 de Estados Unidos, 6 de Uruguay, 5 de Chile, 4 de Panamá, 3 de Costa Rica, 3 de la República Dominicana, 3 de El Salvador, 3 de Nicaragua. También hay algunos de Perú, Canadá, Francia, Alemania, Suiza, Reino Unido, Austria, Bolivia, Dinamarca, España, Guinea Ecuatorial, Honduras, Guatemala, India, Luxemburgo, Venezuela. Así que realmente pues tenemos una comunidad muy importante que está participando a lo ancho y largo de nuestro país y por supuesto en el resto del mundo. Pero también quiero compartirles que en cuestión de género, aproximadamente la tercera parte de los que participan han sido mujeres, lo cual nos da una gran satisfacción, ya que la participación de mujeres en el sector energético continúa incrementándose y es algo que particularmente hemos estado impulsando en la Secretaría de Energía durante esta administración. No quiero quitarles más tiempo, agradezco nuevamente a la Agencia Internacional de Energía por este apoyo, en especial a Brian Motherway, director de la División de Eficiencia Energética, a todo su equipo, por supuesto, reiterando que ahora como miembros de la Agencia Internacional de Energía, México fortalece las relaciones y el compromiso internacional para continuar promoviendo los múltiples beneficios de la eficiencia energética con oportunidades para modernizar y, por supuesto, fortalecer el sector energético nacional y mundial. Agradezco a mis amigos, los ponentes del día de hoy, Brian Dean y John Dulac. Thanks so much. We really appreciate your time. I know you are really busy. You are hardworking people, and having the opportunity to have you sharing with us some of what you have done is really important, and I really appreciate it. Pero bueno, pues muchísimas gracias a todos una vez más y en este momento le regreso el micrófono a Edith.
Muchísimas gracias, Santiago. Thank you, and thank you for your kind words and for highlighting the success and reach of our webinar series. I'd now like to invite Tiago Barral to say a few words from Brazil.
Hello. First, on behalf of EPE and also the Ministry of Mines and Energy of Brazil, I'd like to thank the IEA team, Edith, Brian Motherway, Melanie, today's presenters, Brian, Dean, and John Dulac, for organizing this webinar, which covers a topic of the highest relevance for Brazil, and as we've heard, Santiago, other countries as well. Would also like to thank our Mexican colleagues and recognize their proactive role in promoting energy-efficient cooling in the international agenda. I'd like to mention some big numbers about Brazil and specifically air conditioning. Since 2006, the number of air conditioners per household in Brazil have almost tripled. And the share of air conditioning in total electricity demand in the residential sector has increased from 7 to more than 13% in 2016. Now, looking into the future, EPE's projections indicate that the annual electricity consumption from air conditioning is likely to reach 29 terawatt-hour in 2027. Last year, it was about 18 terawatt-hour. So this means a growth of almost 60% in the coming 10 years. These numbers, it's easy to see them as well, they illustrate pretty well the challenge that we face ahead and the importance of providing policymakers with consistent analysis and recommendations to improve the quality of energy use in cooling. And also, I would like to highlight the need for engaging the industry and consumers in this challenging task. Finally, I would like to thank especially our Brazilian participants in this webinar and invite you all to contribute with EPE in the promotion of accessible and also efficient cooling in our country, as well as sharing our best practices with other countries. So with this, I end my brief initial note, and I wish you all a good and successful webinar. Thank you again.
Thank you, Thiago, for the very warm welcome, and we're very excited to see strong participation from Brazil in the webinar today. So now I'd like to turn it over to Mel Slade from IA.
So good morning, everybody. Buenos dias, bom dia. Welcome to this webinar on behalf of the IEA. Apologies from Brian Motherway, who was called away unexpectedly. Thanks very much to our partners in Mexico and Brazil for their collaboration with the IEA and for their warm words this morning. This is the first time we've come together for one of these webinars, and hopefully it will be a great success and we'll be able to do it again in the future. So we're looking forward to a very rich discussion on this subject that's important to many parts of the world, and I thank all of the delegates who are joining us and really do encourage you to actively participate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mel. So now I'd like to take a moment to show a brief video to set the stage for today's presentation. John, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for Mel and Santiago and I just want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, for your kind remarks this morning. Indeed, as you just saw in the video, cooling is an extremely hot topic today, and it's one of what our executive director at the IEA is calling blind spots in the global energy system. With very rapid growth, as was mentioned, both in Brazil and Mexico in recent years, and considerable potential for growth in the coming decades as more and more households not only are able to afford cooling services, but also have increasing demand for cooling comfort in buildings. There's quite a few reasons for this. First and foremost, that we know, of course, that in many developing parts of the world, that consumers are able to buy more energy-consuming products, often starting first with things, of course, like refrigerators, but very quickly, especially in hot countries, moving to things like air conditioners. Another part of this story is also that our world is changing for better or worse, and that as you're experiencing this past month, looking already, for example, in India and Pakistan hitting about 50 degrees, just 2 years ago, actually, India hit an all-time record of about 52 degrees Celsius. This summer, again, was roughly about 50 degrees at the very beginning of the hot season in India. And also seeing, for example, in Mexico, that we hit about 50 degrees Celsius just a little over a month ago, with the heat wave that hit most of North America and Europe. Equally seeing that this, of course, has implications on our energy systems. So China, which just a little over 20 years ago had less than 1% ownership of air conditioners in households, and now it's about 65% of households that own an AC. This, of course, when hot days kick in, really drives up energy demand for air conditioning. And in the recent months, with the heat wave that China's been experiencing, This actually led to somewhat of a panic as China was rallying to find enough coal and gas to keep power plants running in order to meet that electricity demand for air conditioners. We've also seen more tragic news in recent weeks with the heat wave that's been affecting much of the northern hemisphere. In Quebec in particular, just a few weeks ago, a deadly heat wave hit parts of southern Quebec province with, in the article here, 33, but actually the death count now is about 37 people from heat exhaustion and heat-related illnesses or causes of death. We're equally seeing the same thing right now, for example, in Japan, where as of this morning, around 50 people have died because of the extreme heat wave that they're experiencing there, with, in particular, the hottest recorded temperatures ever in Tokyo this week. And so, of course, all of these changes in weather, whether they be long-term permanent changes or just extreme changes in heat, particularly during summer months, are driving up demand for air conditioners. And one of the real concerns there, if we look across the average annual temperatures for countries, is that while we know of places, of course, like Africa, Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia that are always hot almost every day of the year, that we're seeing growth also in places that historically did not have much demand for cooling services and buildings. If we look today, for example, in the United States and Japan, we're talking about AC ownership rates of around 90%. If we were to compare this, for example, with India, which is only around 5% of households that own an air conditioner, but that is about 3 times as hot in terms of the mean average cooling degree days, this is a very stark contrast and gives us a sense of what might be to come as households come online in terms of purchasing power and expectations around comfort. Now, as part of the cooling report that we did this winter, that was just released in May, we plotted these cooling degree days across the world and started looking at population concentrations today and found that about 3 billion people, so just under 40% of the world's current population, live in places where it is hot every single day of the year. And if we look at statistics around cooling ownership in those hot places, only around 8% of those people actually own an air conditioner. And it's no surprise to see that a significant portion of Latin America, Africa, and South and Southeast Asia are the places where this is happening. And as we equally expect considerable growth for demand in energy services, as well as growth in ownership of energy-consuming appliances in those regions, it comes as no surprise that we also think that air conditioning services and air conditioner ownership could increase drastically in the coming decades. To give you a sense of what we think is likely to happen in terms of potential demand for air conditioning, whether it's efficient or not efficient, we think the world could essentially triple the global air conditioner stock over the next 30 years, where obviously a significant portion of this growth would be coming from Asia, and China and India in particular, but also in places like Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, whose smaller populations mean that their share in terms of the total AC units that you see here does not look so significant. However, it still is a considerable amount of air conditioner sales. If we look just at Latin America and the Caribbean, this means that over the next 30 years, we expect to go from roughly 100 million air conditioners today, to nearly 500 million air conditioners by 2050. And when we combine all of this, the numbers are absolutely staggering. This effectively means that we sell across the world about 10 air conditioners every single second for the next 30 years. And it really drives home this concept of the need to address efficient cooling services in buildings if we are to see those significant growth in AC ownership. Now, globally, one of our real concerns in looking at air conditioners, and we'll come back to this in just a second, looking at what people are actually buying today across markets, is that we know that energy efficiency is often not the first thing on people's mind when they go to buy an AC. They're very much looking at the need for cooling comfort. In many instances, I mentioned, this might also be driven by things like extreme heat, so they're looking for immediate comfort. And particularly in many markets, this is also a question of price sensitivities. So they're not looking at efficiency labels, instead they're looking at the price of the air conditioner product. And what this means very often is that we do not buy the most efficient air conditioners. And as part of this Future of Cooling report, we looked at what would happen if the world were continuing to buy these less efficient air conditioning products. And globally speaking, what this means is that cooling could represent as much as 20% of global electricity demand growth over the next 30 years, and as much as 40% of building sector electricity demand by 2050. So these are obviously staggering numbers, and of course they have implications as to what this means for the global energy system, and in particularly for electricity generation. So just to give you a sense, as you saw in the video, if we combine all of this and look at the thousands of terawatt hours of electricity that would be consumed by air conditioners, it means that we would have to build the equivalent of the current power generation capacity of the US, the European Union, and Japan, or if you want another equivalent, India, that's already installed today. So these obviously mean significant investments in power generation in order to keep up with growing AC demand. Now, the particular concern for air conditioners, beyond the fact that this will add considerable strain to our power systems, is also that, typically speaking, especially in the residential sector, those air conditioners come on in the evening when people come home. And this does not necessarily coincide with the trends in power generation, and particularly looking forward at potential for renewables in our energy systems, which means that cooling, which already places a considerable strain on electricity systems in some countries, could add even more strain to peak electricity loads in the evening time. Now, just to give you a sense of what we already see happening today and what could be the case in our baseline scenario, looking at less efficient cooling purchases over the next 30 years. If we are looking, for example, at markets like the United States today, as much as 30% of average national peak load is already consumed by air conditioners. Now, as I mentioned, the United States already has an extremely high ownership of air conditioners, and we wouldn't expect places like the US or Japan to see significant increases in that peak cooling load. But if we were to look at major markets for potential cooling growth, like India, Indonesia, Mexico, and Brazil, for example, we could see significant increases in the role cooling will play in terms of impact on electricity grids, particularly during peak demand times. Hitting as much, for example, here as 30% in Brazil and as much as 45% in India. Now, the positive news there, of course, is that we can do something about this. And we'll talk about some of the different options for addressing cooling demand. But in what we call our efficient cooling scenario, we considered a very straightforward question as to what the implications would be for efficient cooling if we were to improve the efficiency of the boxes. So if everyone were to buy more efficient air conditioners, what kind of impact would this have on electricity demand, and as you see here, on peak electricity demand in our power systems? And as you can see across the board for pretty much everyone, we see considerable reductions in peak electricity demand. And this, of course, has implications on things like the need to build peak power plants, which are extremely expensive to build in terms of capex and to operate, as well as the need to address issues that are close to many of our hearts, things like local air pollution that is often driven by things like peak power demand. And so the efficiency measures, just by addressing more efficient boxes, would have considerable implications for our sustainable development goals, and in particular with respect to the electricity demand generated by air conditioning.
So what we've found, though, is that energy efficiency policy is not keeping up with technologies. Of course, what you can see from this map is that many of the largest countries and many of the large hot countries actually do have mandatory policies in place, minimum energy performance standards. But what we've found, though, is that they're typically not as efficient as they could be and should be per the plan of the efficient cooling scenario that John just spoke about. So what we've found here, though, is that there's an infrastructure in place. The policy infrastructure is there, but we need to have some aggressive plans to improve the minimum requirements across all the countries of the world. When we look at it from a technology perspective, what you can see in this chart of energy efficiency ratios in a watt per watt basis is that most countries, if you look at the yellow bar, you'll see that the average efficiency that's achieved in the market is well below the best available technology. You'll also notice that the best available technology between countries varies significantly. So that means we need to work both on increasing the minimum energy performance standards, but also on the technology transfer between countries. And certainly getting rid of the red dots at the bottom where there's really inefficient technologies that are available. So what we have found is from the energy efficiency ratio, which is typically a measure of the impact on the peak energy use from an air conditioner, is that the typical air conditioner in the market is less than half of the efficiency of what is available. And then more dramatically, what we've found from the average seasonal efficiency ratio, a SEER, is that typical air conditioners that are in houses today is less than 1/3 of the best available technology. So there's significant room for improvement of our policies and the technologies that are being sold in the market based on technologies that's already available today. So, as John mentioned, in our modeling, we looked at this baseline scenario of what could happen if there were inefficient technologies that were used out to 2050 compared to this efficient cooling scenario. What happens if we doubled the efficiency of air conditioners globally? And of course, what we can see is there's a significant impact on the terawatt hours that are needed. And in fact, in the Latin America region, we see 4,500 terawatt hours of electricity savings for the region out to 2050. So that's 30 years of savings of 4,500 terawatt hours is equivalent to all of the electricity that Mexico has used in the last 25 years. So significant amount of electricity just for air conditioning. And so this is the analysis that we've shown, and you know, just this simple idea that if we all improved our air conditioners, there's a significant opportunity out there.
Okay, so coming back again to the issues around the implications for cooling on the broader energy system, as we mentioned, one of the key pieces here is that efficient cooling, by deploying, again, as Brian mentioned, these much more efficient air conditioners, can have considerable impact on the investments necessary for the power system, both in terms of power generation capacity as a whole, but particularly with respect to peak power generation capacity investments. And the savings there, if looking at Latin America and Caribbean, are not insignificant. We're talking about around $140 billion in reduced needs for power generation investments just for cooling. And of course, we hope that these savings would be used and passed on to consumers, meaning that by pursuing an efficient cooling scenario, reducing those power generation investment needs would equally translate into a cost to consumers to operate their air conditioners that would cut it by around 60%. And these are not insignificant when talking about a rather considerable portion of many households' budgets in order to have access to cooling comfort and cooling services in buildings. Now, the other piece there, of course, is that driving down the need for things like power investments, and particularly peak power investments, means that we open doors for opportunities for our sustainable development goals, particularly with respect to decarbonizing the power system, which of course allows first and foremost greater deployment of renewables in the system, but equally that drives down the need for the overall electricity generation. And we have found, looking across our energy technology modeling, that not only does the efficiency have an impact on the building's energy consumption, but also plays a significant role in terms of strategies for the power sector, where effectively what you're seeing here, and this again is just for Latin America and the Caribbean, is that we could see a considerable jump, so nearly a 2.5 increase in the emissions related to space cooling in buildings in our baseline scenario, but that we could cut this by more than 50% just from efficient air conditioning in our efficient cooling scenario. And of course, this enables, as I said, increased investment in things like renewables and clean power generation in the electricity system. And when the two are combined, we can actually drastically reduce emissions related to what they are today. So positive win-win situation for everyone. And just as the last comment before speaking about some of the other measures that we can take, I think an additional piece to think about here is the relationship of efficient cooling with access to cooling services. So in many of your countries, and for a significant portion of countries around the world looking at their sustainable development goals, it's not just about the efficiency. It's again looking at issues like air pollution, something we also address in this report, as well as the cost to consumers, so allowing more people access to affordable cooling services in buildings. And as Brian will present to you now, we can actually go further than this, which really gives a sense of the scope of what we can do in terms of providing that access to cooling comfort.
Yeah, so beyond the simple message of increasing the efficiency of our air conditioners, of course, we didn't want to stop there. We wanted to say, well, what happens if you reduce the need for air conditioning? What happens if you bring cooling thermal comfort to people through improved building energy efficiency, through better building design, better insulation, better windows, and the construction process of the building itself. And of course, what we find is that there are significant additional energy savings that are cost effective and ready to be had today. It is, especially for existing buildings, it's a larger effort, and so therefore the energy savings are not as quick as with the air conditioner themselves. But what we see is if you take this approach where you renovate buildings when they're being renovated and you make them more energy efficient, and if you make your new buildings more energy efficient, there will be significant additional energy savings, as you can see with the tan lines at the bottom. So the main point, as John said, is creating this access to cooling, this cooling thermal comfort that will help alleviate the problems that we saw in the first slide, where there's extreme heat and even deaths from this extreme heat. So how do we see this moving forward? What we see is that there's a combination of action that needs to happen around the world. Absent that firm policy interventions, we will see the demand for cooling rise, and we'll see the energy demand, and particularly the peak energy demand, increase dramatically. However, minimum energy performance standards, so MEPS, for air conditioners can deliver energy savings quickly. Building envelope improvements can contribute those additional long-term energy savings and cooling thermal comfort. And we see that further energy savings can be achieved through consumer awareness, so labeling of efficient products, efficient buildings, establishing mandatory building energy codes, and bringing stakeholders together to identify strategies and solutions for sustainable cooling. So at the end of the day, we see that energy efficiency can deliver cooling comfort and do it both affordably and sustainably. Now, IEA has some online resources that we've built through this project, and we have now a global exchange on efficiency for cooling. And you can find those resources at iea.org/cooling and iea.org/exchange/cooling, so two different websites that have a wealth of information. Part of the information is our policies database on cooling, so you can find out what other policies are happening around the world for air conditioning and other cooling technologies. There's also an online database where we track the actual equipment that is around the world, and we will be continuing to expand this database throughout the rest of this year. You can see the efficiency levels from an energy efficiency ratio, from a SEER. You can look at commercial versus residential, and you can actually start to dig in on where the efficient technologies are around the world. And then finally, we do look at policy coverage like the map we showed earlier, but also how the minimum energy performance standards have evolved through the years, and how the minimum energy performance standards evolve by equipment type as well. So these are the resources that are available, and as shown in the video, you can find out more at iea.org/cooling.
Thank you, Brian and John. So we have a few minutes for questions. Just one question that came up that I'll answer myself. There was a question on whether the presentation would be available, and it will be, so don't worry about that. And I think perhaps the next question that I'll ask John about is there's a comment that there's a low penetration right now of air conditioning in households in Mexico today, and there are barriers to making the case for efficient cooling technologies, among other things because of high subsidies. And so how do you make a case in Mexico for more efficient appliances and retrofits?
No, I think this is an extremely important question, and as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, price elasticities around demand for energy services, particularly in residential buildings, and sensitivities around prices of equipment purchases, especially in nascent markets where households are just being able to afford energy-consuming products like refrigerators and air conditioners, can have a major impact in terms of decision-making by consumers and what products they buy. Interestingly enough, there's a couple of things that we see happening in markets here. The first is that, as Brian showed you, the availability of more efficient products very often is the case for pretty much all of the major cooling markets that we've looked at in this report. And I think more interestingly is that those products don't necessarily have a higher price tag. That's not the case in all countries, but we have found very often that the more efficient products don't necessarily cost much more. Now, part of this, of course, comes back to questions as to how consumers make decisions around air conditioner purchases. Is it the first product they see on the shelves with a price that they like, that they buy? Do they actually do research on it? So these come to questions around consumer awareness, information, standards and labeling. But the second piece that is very often the case is that more efficient products can be more expensive. Now, the positive news there is that across 40 years of IEA experience working with our member countries and associates and other country partners, we know that energy efficiency performance standards can drive more efficient products and markets at or below cost. The trick to this is first and foremost making sure that the policies are clear and that they are designed in consultation with industry to make sure that those products can be rolled out in an appropriate time and manner in order to ensure that prices do not jump significantly, particularly as mentioned for Mexico in markets where people are just starting to be able to afford air conditioners. And the intent, of course, is not that people don't get to buy an AC, but that they buy an efficient air conditioner. Now, around this question of price sensitivities, one of the typical concerns is that from a manufacturing perspective in particular, is that there's not enough scale in the market to justify the increase in those efficiencies. So a manufacturer might be willing to sell a more efficient air conditioner if they get to sell 100,000 of them, for example, or 1 million of them. And if they think that the market is quite small, they might be hesitant to sell more efficient products. So as part of our discussions and the follow-up work that the IEA will be doing on this cooling, we have been working with countries and with industry to understand the conditions around which we can sell more efficient air conditioners. What would be the incentives? What would be the policy frameworks? What would be the market mechanisms? And just as an example there, taking the case of Mexico, since I know Mexico pretty well, is that while households may not have a significant penetration of air conditioner ownership, commercial buildings and public buildings do have a considerable amount of air conditioning. And many of those products, just like residential air conditioners, are not very efficient. And so working with manufacturers, working with international bodies like the IEA, looking across opportunities regionally, particularly in Latin America, the question is, can we build that scale, for example, to replace those inefficient air conditioners in public buildings, in schools, in commercial buildings, and use that to drive the necessary scale to make sure that efficient air conditioners are available for this booming residential market.
Thank you, John. The next question, I'm going to combine two questions into one. So what should minimum energy performance standards be for air conditioning inverter equipment? And related to that, which companies produce efficient air conditioners?
So what we find, of course, is that most air conditioning companies actually do produce highly efficient equipment. And as John mentioned, oftentimes they're focusing their mass manufacturing on what they think will sell. So if the minimum energy performance standards are low, then they think that they'll probably sell more of the inefficient technology compared to the more efficient technologies. But most manufacturers actually have the technologies and the components to build both inefficient and highly efficient technologies. Regarding the minimum energy performance standards, there's significant room for improvement globally. And of course, what we see is that oftentimes there are differentiation of minimum performance allowed based on equipment type. So the question of what should an inverter AC be versus a fixed speed AC? Well, from an energy efficiency perspective, both technologies should be considered equal from an efficiency, if we're going to save energy, I should say. And so, you know, whether it's a fixed speed or an inverter, whether it's a small air conditioner or a big air conditioner, we certainly need to know what's physically and technically possible from a manufacturer perspective. But we have data on about 2 million air conditioners globally, and we do see that, well, the most efficient technology has a 42 SEER from a BTU per watt perspective, which is about 12.3 on a watt per watt perspective. So the chart that we showed you earlier on a watt per watt perspective, 12.3 is the highest from a seasonal energy efficiency ratio. On an energy efficiency ratio from a peak perspective, we have many technologies that are at 5, 6, 7 EER. And so as we consider where those best available technologies are and where the manufacturers can produce them, the minimum energy performance should look at the cost effectiveness of those technologies and what would happen, like John said, if they were able to start mass manufacturing the efficient technologies, and the prices will go down. So there's a cost effectiveness that will happen through the policy. So, you know, I would certainly encourage getting the minimum energy performance standards well above 4, well above where the market is today already. And we've seen that when we look at the data from each country, we see that the average market is close to where the minimum energy performance standards are, but that there's a lot of technology from a lot of companies that's available well above what's being put into homes.
Thank you, Brian. John, a question for you. Often some of the most difficult data to find is the market share of equipment types being sold. Can you comment on where we can find this type of information, or how we can go about collecting it if it's not available?
So as Brian mentioned, the IEA, in particular in support of what's called the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. So we didn't discuss this in detail in our slide, but some of you may be familiar with the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which is looking to phase out, or phase down rather, the use of hydrofluorocarbons and refrigerants in cooling equipment, as well as in refrigerators globally. And the IEA is the host of what is known as the Kigali Tracker. So we are working with partners and with industry to collect information on air conditioners and to understand, first and foremost, as Brian mentioned, what is available in markets and where the efficiency potential is, but equally to get a sense of what is being sold in markets. And very often this is done through things like product registries, especially in countries that have mandatory reporting from industry as part of their energy performance standards and labeling schemes. And in others, this can be quite difficult. I think there are a few venues, and there is more information in some of the IEA's what we call policy pathways around energy performance standards for appliances and equipment that can include different schemes, either directly requiring, for example, as I mentioned, registries of products that are sold by manufacturers. We're also seeing some innovative approaches to this. So, for example, very common in China and increasingly in Asia today, as well as other parts of the world, we're seeing QR codes, which are being used as a consumer awareness tool as part of labeling and standards. And that, in fact, that information, because it's digitized, allows us to collect information remotely, or even to have people go out in stores, scan the QR codes, and know what is typically sold in stores. So while we agree, since we are trying to collect this information, that getting information and data on what is actually being sold and is available in markets, we do see this improving, and we certainly encourage countries as they look at updating or putting in place energy performance standards, that they do consider at the same time registries for products, which informs first and foremost what's available to consumers, and second, informs whether or not the policy as it takes place is actually having an effect in markets.
Thank you. So a question now for Brian. A couple of questions. What are the provisions in Latin America for retrofitting of inefficient HVAC systems? maybe we'll start with that one and then I'll ask the next one. Okay, and then the next question is, which refrigerants do you find most efficient for AC split inverter equipment?
Yeah, so I was looking to take both those questions at the same time because I think they're an interesting combination. Certainly, what we do find is that maintenance of existing HVAC systems is incredibly important, both for the operational energy use, but also when it comes to refrigerants. And we often find that there is leakage of refrigerants, which when John was talking about the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, limiting the HFCs is an important part of the energy efficient retrofit of the air conditioning equipment itself. Now, there are many situations where retrofitting existing highly inefficient equipment is not going to be either cost effective or an efficient approach. So certainly there should be analysis conducted to look at the potential to bring in highly efficient equipment that is more cost effective and more sustainable from a refrigerant perspective and from an energy efficiency perspective. On the refrigerant side, and talking about the phase out of CFCs, HFCs, and HCFCs, what we've found is that there are a number of highly efficient refrigerants that are being tested on the market. Some of them have no global warming potential from the leakage of the refrigerant, and some have low and mid. And I think the main goal of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program right now is to help identify which of those low and no global warming potential technologies is the future. So I think in the years ahead we will see ourselves phasing out of many of the refrigerant types that were mentioned in the question, and and I don't want to get into company property, their actual company products that are some of the refrigerant types, and but there's certain ones that I think will end up phasing out through the Kigali Amendment, and we'll start to see a greater adoption of the low and no HFC technologies.
Thank you, Brian. John, a couple questions for you. Maybe a short one. Do the scenarios account for adaptation, that is for future rising temperatures? And the second question is, what is the distribution of electricity consumption for AC by type of equipment?
So in response to the first question, looking at the scenarios, and again, you can find a lot of this information both in our report, but also, as Brian mentioned, on this IAorg/cooling website. We did work with partners looking, as I showed you in this map, at the distribution of the daily mean average temperatures across the world, and at the cooling degree days relative to several different set point temperatures. So very often CDD 18 relative to 18 degrees is used. We also looked at 20 and 22 degrees, as in some countries the comfort norms are a little bit different, particularly for countries where they're used to having hotter temperatures. And we equally looked at these with respect to the outlook to 2050, with respect to the climate change scenarios that are produced by some of our partners, and what this would mean in terms of CDD growth. It is not surprising, of course, in our baseline scenario, which also has, of course, implications across the energy system in terms of emissions, that we see CDDs practically everywhere going up. And then in some places it will be significant increases. Brazil and Mexico in particular, as well as a significant part of Latin America, see considerable increases, as much as 15 to 30% in the average number of CDDs in 2050 compared to today. So please do take a look at the report, and then don't hesitate to send us questions in terms of that analysis if you have any additional questions. With respect to the second question, looking at electricity consumption and equipment type. This is a relatively difficult question to answer because it does depend first and foremost on the market. While in North America, for example, particularly in the United States, northeastern United States, and in Canada, we often see packaged room air conditioners, or conversely, in much of the south and southwest of the United States, we tend to see split or ducted units, particularly because of HVAC systems that are used in that part of the country. We'll see in China, much of Japan, split and mini-split units. So it really, again, does depend much on the region. In Mexico, in Guatemala, in Brazil, and much of Latin America today, we're seeing combinations of either packaged room units or split room units. Again, this is a little bit of both architectural and cultural preferences in terms of consumer purchases. But in terms of electricity consumption, this very much depends, of course, on the product efficiency as well as the size. So while in principle, a packaged room unit typically is smaller than, for example, a split unit that might treat several rooms, it really does depend on the size of the unit, so the wattage of that unit and how much energy it consumes. As Brian mentioned, across the board, what we're seeing in terms of technical availability and this product registry we're developing, it really doesn't matter if it's a split or packaged or inverter or room unit, that we are seeing availability of much more efficient products practically for all of these types of air conditioning.
Thank you. So perhaps this is our last question. I'm looking at the time. We won't get to all of the questions. We've had a very active audience, so we'll think about how to best address some of the questions that we haven't been able to address online. Brian, and maybe John too, if you have something to add, what mechanisms are available to provide incentives to manufacturers to move towards production of more efficient, energy efficient products? And related to that, how, particularly where historically it's been difficult to engage and gather relevant data from industry, how do we engage the industry productively on this issue?
Yeah, that's two really good questions. The first part of that I think is a little bit easier. The last part, we often find that engaging with industry is easy. In fact, they often get heavily involved with the policy setting process, but they tend to not give their data away. And so if there are ways of having the policies and the regulations require certain data types, as John mentioned earlier, whether it's from an import-export basis or whether it's a product manufacturer basis, there is a way for the government to set regulations to collect some bits of data without crossing the line on the company's own intellectual property and their information. Now, in terms of actually incentivizing the shift in manufacturing, there's actually a lot of mechanisms that can be used, and it comes down to a combination of policies and programs. One program that I really like is a bulk purchase type of program, where in India right now, for example, the Energy Efficiency Services Limited, which is a super ESCO, a super energy services company, they've committed to buying 100,000 highly efficient air conditioners. And of course, what happens when product manufacturers get an order for 100,000 highly efficient air conditioners? Well, they have to produce those, and they'll produce more. So as John mentioned earlier, the cost for each equipment when doing bulk manufacturing ends up going down. And of course, bulk purchasing enables the products to be purchased at a lower price as well. So that, I think, is one good program. Also, from a minimum energy performance standard and from a label perspective, oftentimes governments need to work on specifications with the product manufacturers. Specifications on what achieves that minimum energy performance or what achieves qualifying to use a label on that air conditioner or energy efficient product. And so those specifications can both increase the energy efficiency, can be done in a way of reducing the cost to manufacture, and also increase the reliability and the trust that the consumers have in the product. All of those can be done hand in hand with government and the manufacturing and other stakeholders working together. And I'd say the last thing is just really setting a timeline that works on each of those components. So whether that's a bulk purchase, minimum energy performance standard, or a label, to set that timeline in a way that manufacturers are able to deliver those products to the market.
Thank you, Brian. So with that, I think we're going to close. Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. We're looking forward to further engaging with Mexico, Brazil, and the broader region on this very important topic. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be sending out via email a short survey and would very much appreciate your feedback on this webinar and on future webinar topics. So you'll have a chance to help us choose future topics of interest to you. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.